And we are back. Hello, I am Steelfur, and this is Steelfur Speaks, where we talk about the latest FAB news, decks, tactics, tournaments, drama, things that have happened, things the community's saying. I keep a good ear open to what's going on in the community, and I like to turn those cards into, listening into easily digestible news and commentary about what is going on. If you have not listened to my channel before, very, very welcome, and I look forward to talking to you all today. So on the topic of discussion today, we of course have Dusk to Dawn. We have sample decks and deck ideas for all of the new heroes that I've put together and that we're going to run through, right? So obviously there are traditional ways to build these heroes we're going to talk about, and we're going to talk about what's changed, and then we're going to show the decks that I've been putting together, and we're going to kind of go through. The only deck I do not have one for, apologies to all Bolton fans, we will be talking about Bolton, but I don't have a deck put together yet for Bolton. He's not my favorite hero, so I don't really necessarily know how to build him perfectly. We are going to talk about what this sort of set kind of leads into in terms of strategy, and whether his traditional approach to Luminous Ascension is going to still be viable. So stay tuned for that. There will be timestamps in this video for all the different heroes, so if you're really not interested in me talking about Prism or any of the others, then you can jump to that section of the video. So let's start with Prism. So obviously in the previous incarnation of Prism, we had a very aura-focused deck. What that meant was that you would be filling the board with things like, well, they're not in here obviously, but you would be filling the board with things like, let's just go to this deck, with things like Shimmers of Silver, with things like Parable of Humility, Ode to Wrath, Genesis, and stuff like Arclight Sentinel. And then you would be using those to attack with Luminaris, which was the old weapon. And Luminaris would let these auras attack for 1 every turn. So you were looking for those turns where you would play 2 auras in a turn, and then you would attack for 2 or 1, you know, if it was a blue aura. But you would eventually get to a point where you had some auras on the board, and you could ping your opponent down for 1 and for 1 and for 1. And that gave you kind of an opening to sort of whittle their health down. And then you also got to use effects like Merciful Retribution that deals arcane damage. Have a lot of spectral shields that you just sort of poke them with for 1, and generally get that sort of control board state game plan, right? What has changed? Well, Luminaris, the thing that enabled that, has been banned, and Prism herself also living legend. So we now have new Prism, Awakener of Soul, who promises a different style of gameplay. So, Prism Awakener of Soul says whenever a card with Herald in its name is put into Prism's Soul during an action phase, you may search your deck for a Figment, put it into an arena, and then 2 cost instant, banish target Figment, banish a card from Prism's Soul, awaken target Figment you control. So you're going to be hitting with auras, Heralds, one of these. These are the attack actions that pop when they're blocked with something that hits for 6 or more. And then those are going to let you search for these Figments, which all have an enter the arena effect. You make spectral shields, deal 1 arcane damage, and then you may flip one of those for 2 into one of these angels, which is an ally with 4 health, 4 attack, and ward 4, and another ability that triggers when they attack. So we're not going to sit down and run through all of the heroes. That's a different video. You can find it on my channel, which runs through all of the cards in Dusk to Dawn and rates them. We are, however, going to turn our attention to the idea of what decks this enables. So we have 2 very, very different types of cards. We have cards that are focused on building board state, so the angels, the auras, and then we have cards that are focused on heralds, giving attacks with heralds, go again, giving buffs to heralds, stopping heralds from being broken by phantasm, because remember, when a herald is defended by a card with 6 or more power, it will get destroyed. Also making heralds block better. Basically, heralds.deck, right? Now, is that a good idea? We're going to get into that. So, let's take a look first at what the ideal Prism looks like if you rely mostly on cards from this set. Now, this isn't a finalized deck list. It's just the beginnings of an idea of a deck list. So, it's going to show you which cards I value and whether they go in red or blue or yellow. That's something that testing will show later on. So, and that's why also these aren't 60-60 lists. So, you know, this is going to take some refinement. It's not even on Talishar yet, so we can't even test. So let's start with the heralds. What are the best heralds? The best heralds are, in this rough order, Wartune Herald, right? Because it costs 1 and comes in for 7. That's amazing rate. Herald of Protection, because it gives you Spectral Shield. So in a sense, if this hits, it's an 8 power swing. because it gives you 1 life back when it hits in the form of a shield. And if you can do something with that shield, even better. And then we have, I guess there's a bit of a debate. So you have Herald of Rebirth, which potentially should be in this deck, just to recycle some of the heralds, but I don't necessarily always put it in large amounts. Because it's, you don't necessarily, like, hitting with this doesn't make your opponent scared. If you get a Spectral Shield and you can use it in a bad way, or you're doing an extra arcane damage, that kind of thing, your opponents are going to be a bit more worried. If you're just recycling something, maybe they're not. But Rebirth should potentially go in. I've got it in blue here, but it could go in as a red. Blue and red are the good breakpoints. The 6 power ones aren't as good. And that's a good idea to keep in mind with a lot of the heralds as well, is that the 6 power ones aren't necessarily as good. Because they don't hit a breakpoint. They just demand a sort of straight block. But there are options there. So then, really, we're looking at a deck that focuses on a few angles, right? You're not running all of these auras. You're probably running the ones that benefit your heralds, right? So Merciful Retribution, for example, means that when one of your heralds gets destroyed, it still goes to your soul, which still triggers the prism. So if you've got a free turn, like say turn 0, you attack with a herald, they pop it, you flash in a Merciful Retribution, or you might take damage to set that up. That herald will go into your soul and you'll get this figment. I think I might be missing a few figments. They should all be in here. This is Angels and Figments deck, so it's running the new Luminaris that gives heralds go again, or angels go again, and then basically tries to capitalize on that. You run a few Arclight Sentinels to disrupt people when you need to. You run these blue auras because they're really good for making your opponent spend a turn to kill them. And also, having some shields. You might not run Haze Bending, but you will probably run something like Passing Mirage and Pierce Reality. Though I do like the idea that if you're running the Passing Mirages and the Pierce Realities, you also run Haze Bending with Merciful Retribution, as that gives you kind of like a late game controller option to deal some arcane damage. And it just lets you mix things up a little bit. And this is kind of a point that I'd like to make, which is that I don't think Prism is ever going to go fully one way or another. I think she's always going to have some flex where she includes some of these auras and some of the good cards here that like let you do. Because, for example, Wartune Herald plus a blue aura, you can give Wartune Herald fairly easy. Go again with Luminaris with a blue, and then you can play one of these blue auras, and that's a really good turn, right? Which is one of the reasons why Wartune Herald is I think going to be a 9 of in this deck, right? The question marks for me and the things that I think people have to test is, do you want to be giving Heralds go again with Angelic Descent? Are you giving Heralds plus attack with Angelic Wrath? Do you need to, or is it better to just play another Herald with that card from your hand? Are you blocking with Heralds that much with Celestial Resolve, right? That kind of stuff needs to be tested. And also generally, and the shame for people who are looking at Prism and thinking of this Herald support and getting really excited, we do have to ask how much the card that gives minus attack to a card blocking a Herald is going to be played, because there are a lot of heroes, including Vincent, who we'll look at later, who can pop Heralds pretty quickly. And one of the reasons you might want to run things like not run Angelic Wrath, for example, not run Angelic Descent, is that part of Prism's game plan with Heralds in the past has been using Phantasmal Footsteps, expecting the first one to get popped, and then going in with the second one, right? And using something like Ghostly Touch to get late game value. So we're not really entirely sure yet what that configuration is going to look like, but this is kind of a rough idea of where that deck's going to go. It's going to go Wartune Heralds. Heralds are protection. It's probably going to play some sort of Angelic Descent or Go Again. It's probably going to play some of the buffs, and it's a good idea to sort of mix those things together. So if you're looking at that Angel style of Prism, this is kind of roughly where I would start, and I would start just adding the cards in and experimenting. Again, there's no answers here. We're just starting off with an idea of what might work. Onto the other idea of Prism, and this is kind of what I played in Blitz, which is Iris Prism. So moving on then. So Irish Prism. I jokingly call it Irish Prism because my Apple autocorrect always changes it to Irish Prism every time I'm talking about it. But Iris Prism is kind of interesting because some of the angels, like Erudition, Rebirth, to a lesser extent Ravages, definitely protection, maybe not Triumph, actually. I think you probably take out Triumph. But definitely these four have quite good synergy. And you could kind of understand maybe trying to get them into play, but at least just having them as 4 cards in your deck. Maybe you hit with a Herald, maybe you bring it out. The question is how many Heralds you run. It's a big question for Iris Prism. But basically you're running all of the auras, and you're running Iris of Reality, which lets you swing with any of your auras for 4. And the idea basically is kind of like old Luminaris Prism. You build up a board state, you block a lot with defense reactions, try and get rid of a lot of your opponent's reds to create windows for you to basically build a board state with these auras, get some shields into play, and then attack with those shields using Iris of Reality. And it kind of plays similar to Guardian, because when you have those auras in play, any blue in your hand becomes a 0 for 4 weapon. And that gives you a lot of flexibility with things you can do. So this is kind of more of a slow, grindy, but it is more proven. And the one thing about Heralds is the one thing about Iris Prism is that it's a lot less dependent on whether or not they have a lot of 6 blocks. So you can take this deck against someone like New Levia or against Vincent without worrying so much about the poppers, because your Heralds are there as an alternative, but they're not your main strategy. Your main strategy is going to be using your auras in a good way to attack and put pressure on your opponent. And that kind of means that, you know, you're not as dependent against poppers. So this might be the list that people actually end up running. The real question is, it was good in Blitz because you could fatigue people out of reds pretty quickly. People had set deck lists. CC decks are a lot more resistant to fatigue, so I'm not sure this deck list is very good. And that's kind of a general conclusion, is I'm not actually that hot on New Prism right now. For me, the big issue is simply that there are lots of heroes that have 6 power who are quite popular in the meta. Obviously, that doesn't include Ranger, but it does include a lot of heroes. And the other thing is that just if we go back to these Angels, right? I mean, I can't seem to zoom in, but if we go back to the Angels, it's important to remember they all have Ward 4, and Ward 4 is inherently quite a fragile thing because, you know, with Dromai, one of the strengths that she has is you have to actually attack the dragons, which diverts health away from her, and you do have to kill the dragons with 4 power. You know, if it has 4 health, 4 power, that takes away 4 power from your deck. So where the dragons heal you 4 life, because every time you have to attack them, that's 4 power out of your opponent's deck, and you'll eat reds, you'll eat weapon swings, you'll eat everything. Ward is inherently more fragile because you could attack the Angels directly, or you could just get 1 damage through against Prism, and then Ward is going to trigger, and that's going to destroy the Angels. So really, you know, if someone attacks you for 7 and you can only block for 6, it's so much harder to keep the Angels alive. And I think that is the inherent flaw. I was hoping when I saw the Angels originally spoiled that we would see something that let us control Ward, or, you know, or something that says, you know, Ward 4 only triggers when you would take 4 or more damage. But instead, we're still in the same situation, that 1 unblocked dagger, 1 point that goes over on an attack, you know, even a lunging press or something like that would effectively kill an Angel that you've spent most of your game and your ability getting into play. So I'm yet convinced, and we will have to play the game and the deck, of course, to see how well it works, but I'm not yet convinced the Angels really have the staying power to become a fundamental archetype in Prism. They might just be useful for their enter-play effects, which are good, and you might play them as a supplemental, but I'm also kind of worried about the amount of 6 powers and how those affect Prism's game plan into other heroes. So I'm not really sure how viable she'll be, but obviously we're going to test her because she's new and shiny, and she's always been quite a powerhouse in the format. Moving on then to one of the heroes that I am actually very excited about, and I kind of surprised myself with this one, because originally it was my intention to sell out of Runeblade. But actually the Vincent ability, I'm going to say Vincent the entire time, it feels like it should have an N in there. The Vincent ability is actually something that I think has been quite interesting. Now, I will preface this by saying I do think it is clunky. It's going to take a bit of time to develop, but I think it is interesting, and I'm curious to see where it goes. So Vincent, for those that aren't following, Shadow Runeblade hero replacing Chain. They didn't want to repeat of Chain. I think partly because Ursa really requires a lot of cards to be banished to play, and I don't think they really wanted to repeat Ursa. And also I think there's some story stuff going on with Chain So maybe they just wanted different variety. But she's leaning back into Rune Chants, which I really like. I've always liked Rune Chant generation in Runeblade. At the start of your turn, you banish a card from hand if you do create a Rune Chant token. This isn't as punishing as it is in someone like Bolton, who requires cards banished from hand, because obviously a lot of Shadow Runeblade cards, you play them from hand, which does give you a bit of life back into this ability. But I do think it is really interesting to see that and see how it functions. And then whenever you play a shadow non-attack action card, you may pay one life, and if you do, your next Rune Chant effect will deal damage can't be prevented. So I really like the fact that this does unpreventable damage, which can build up over the course of a game. And I really like sort of the flexibility that gives you, and I like the Rune Chant generation. I also like the fact they're not repeating the mistakes they made with Chain, so this isn't unlimited card draw, but this is still useful. So there's kind of like two, main ways of building well, actually, we'll say there's three, because there's two that I think everyone's going to try, and then there's one crazy one that I want to try. So the first two are kind of like, do you go tall or go wide, right? Runeblade has a load of tools, like Shadow Runeblade cards, like Shadow Puppetry, things like Moravian Skies, to build a go wide deck. I mean, you look at things like Rift Skitterer, Runic Reckoning, things that make Rune Chants in the middle of a turn, like Revel in Runeblood, will let you play 2 Rune Gate cards a turn. And even if you can't play 2 Rune Gate cards a turn, you can still hit them with a flail, get a Rune Chant for next turn. So going wide has kind of its benefits. And then there's the Go Tall deck, which basically looks to play 1 big Rune Gate card a turn, using things like Envelop in Darkness to get that extra Rune Chant token to take you up to 2 or 3 and buff your attack. So you're going to come in for, 10 attack with 3 or 4 Rune Chants, which is huge. And if you're playing some of the better Majestic attacks, they're going to be things like banishing arsenals, banishing cards from hand, stuff like that is going to have impact. Because that you have that unpreventable 1 damage, so they're never going to be able to turn off these if a hero has lost life effects. So, you're going to be able to basically line these up the way you want. And, stuff like Deathly Wail, it's going to make Rune Chant tokens. It can make you 2. Stuff like Widespread Annihilation banishes cards from hand. You can use that to banish yours if you need to, but really you're going to control it so you've got no cards in hand, so you don't have to, right? So those are the 2 main archetypes. One is going to be focused more on playing the 2-cost, 2-cost Runegate cards, running very low to the ground, running some Runegate staples like Moravian Skies, and the other one is going to focus more on Envelop in Darkness. The third archetype I chose to put a deck together for, I'm really just not sure if it's going to work, but it's the one I really want to work. It's the one I think will be really interesting, which is more of a tanky, slow Runeblade, which builds up a lot of Rune Chants and uses those to deal a lot of damage in one go. I'm not going to say it's OTK, because I think that's hard for anyone to do in Classic Constructed, but I do think that there is the bones of a deck here that could potentially, say, attack for 20 or 30 Rune Chants, so you spend the early part of the game just doing a little bit of damage where you can, building up some Rune Chants, and then you build up a lot more Rune Chants when you see your Mordred Tides, and you go for it. And the idea is really that with the Runegate mechanic, you don't have to pay for these attacks, so you can block a lot more and still get off your combo, right? So one of the weaknesses that Viserai had in some ways when he was building up all of these Rune Chants was that you had to draw one of these cards that was free, so you could trigger your Rune Chants because you didn't have much life left, but also that you couldn't attack at any point during the game up until the point where you were ready to go off, because your attacks consumed your Rune Chants. What has changed? Well, the first thing we've changed is that we have a weapon that can deal damage to the opponent and generate Rune Chants without actually attacking and triggering those Rune Chants. So we have Scepter of Pain. Now, you could play this in Viserai, but I think why not try it in the new hero? This Grimoire gives one of your non-go again non-attack actions go again, so you could use it, for example, to play a Read the Runes and a Blessing of Occult on the same turn, or to play something, like double Read the Runes with a Mordred Tide or something like that, something that's going to really, really fuel your Rune Chant generation. Or you could use it on your go-off turn to get double triggers on something like, double triggers on a Runegate attack or something that gives you extra, right? So I think the Grimoire is really important. I think the Scepter is really important. You also have the presence of Spellbound Creepers. You also have a lot of instant effects that make rune chants, like Funeral Moon. So if you take 1 damage from Vincent's ability and you have 1 or 2 of these in your banished zone, I'm not saying you want to lose that much life, but maybe you put 1 in there and you wait to see if you draw a Mordred, or you arsenal a Mordred until you've got 1 of these in there. Then you can queue up these effects. So you play Mordred, you lose 1 life from Vincent, and then you play Funeral Moon to get 2 rune chants, and then maybe you play a Read the Runes as well, and you've made like 6 rune chants. You know, and that kind of thing. An early game, you've got stuff like Dread Triptych. You've got Looming Doom as well. If people aren't playing that much Arcane Barrier against you, which aggro decks might not, you could theoretically chuck a Looming Doom out there. Destroy all your rune chants. Now, the interesting thing about Vincent is if you destroy all of your rune chants, and if you've got like 10, you're queuing up 20 damage on Looming Doom, right? But then you just go back to generating more rune chants, which you can then turn into your attack. So you can kind of build a load of rune chants, play something like a Looming Doom, then go back to attacking, and then destroy, and then, you know, build more rune chants or not. And then those rune chants are kind of ticking damage in every single turn your opponent has to respond to. And when I think you combine Looming Doom with something like the Scepter, you might just be putting slow amounts of pressure on your opponent every turn to deal with arcane damage or get blown out of the water, which I think would be quite interesting. The other thing I think that makes this kind of interesting, and it's not sure yet, you know, how good it'll be, but it's the presence of Nazareth. So you can play Nazareth if you've got 6 rune chants. Obviously, the flip side attacks for 6 without go again, unless they have a card in Soul, I think. But the fact that you can play this guy out as a weapon to put pressure on a specific turn when you need to is kind of important. So you've been building up these rune chants for ages. Your opponent's set up a bit. They're starting to threaten you. At that point, you play Narseth and you attack for 6, kind of threatening their life a bit. They have to deal with it, or you get another free attack. And if they, you know, if they don't deal with it, and you play something like Runeblood Incantation, and then you attack with Narseth again, or Nazareth again, you know, and you can threaten people that way. So you have kind of ways of threatening people with the Scepter and Nazareth and Looming Doom that don't really, you know, stop you from dealing damage with your rune chants, which I think is really interesting. So I think the combination of those two things makes me want to play this kind of rune chant focus Vincent. It may not work, but I think this is what I'm going to try. I feel like if I had to pick one that was more reliable, I'd be going with the more tall, you know, you'd be running Deathly Wails, Envelop in Darkness, Putrid Stirrings. I think I'd be focusing more on a tall strategy where I have one of these in Banish. Maybe my hand is a blue, a Deathly Wail in hand and a blue, and I banished Putrid Stirrings last turn. So I'm going to do a Putrid Stirrings with the blue, play Deathly Wail for free, you know, and then just smack someone for 11 with 3 rune chants, and that's going to feel pretty good. And guess what? If you lose life, I've already lost life. If you lose life, I get another 2 rune chants, and I can do something similar again next turn. So I think that's going to be the most consistent, but this is the one that I'm most interested in building. So if you end up building something like this and testing it, do let me know, as I think that would be really interesting. As I said, I don't have a Bolton deck, but we are going to talk about Levia. Levia is essentially saved by her new Levia Redeemed card, which should be here somewhere. Yeah, let's just make sure that's in the deck. It definitely goes on the sideboard. You can't have it in your main deck, or it doesn't work. So really what we're looking at with Levia, and I think the important thing I want to highlight with this video is that there's a few things going on that I think are quite interesting. The first thing is that role of toolbox in your banished zone that Levia's had and taken advantage of before. So that means cards like Howl from Beyond. You know, you want to have a few of those in, maybe at red or yellow, maybe even at blue. That's things like playing, say, one of Ghostly Visit, for example, which is going to let you spring attacks with that. And then there's a new card called... it's a feast, some sort of feast, isn't it? It's Grim Feast, right? So if we look at these 3 cards, I don't think you're ever going to play a lot of them, but you've got Ghostly Visit, you've got Grim Feast, and you've got Howl from Beyond. So Howl from Beyond, you just might cycle, you know, you play it, you buff your attack, and then you banish it with something that banishes from graveyard, like Dread Screamer, and then you play it again, right? You've got Ghostly Visit, which obviously attacks for 1 for 4, which is good for playing after a Dread Screamer or the new Ram Raider, right? Then you've got Howl from Beyond, which just buffs an attack, but you can keep cycling it. And those are really good utility cards to keep available. You know, do you need to gain life? Do you need to attack 1 for 4? Do you need to buff your next attack, right? And one of the things I think is quite interesting about Levia in this set, or Levia, as whatever you want to call it, is that there's now a very big dichotomy between cards that banish from your graveyard and cards that banish from your hand. So all the new cards banish a card at random from your hand, and all the old cards banish a card from your graveyard. Now, what does this mean? So previously you had a tricky balance in Levia where you might want to loop something like a Ghostly Beyond. So you're always doing 6 followed by 4 or something like that. You know, you're always putting pressure on minimal cards. I mean, this is one card, 2 cards in hand. Maybe this is in Arsenal. And then for a blue, you can get 10 damage with 1 card in hand. And then the next time you play a Dread Screamer, you banish the Ghostly Visit. But the problem before with Levia was that you couldn't necessarily control your graveyard as much as you wanted to because a lot of other cards got in there. So you'd play something like a Ghostly Visit or Grim Feast or a Howl from Beyond, and then you wouldn't actually loop it because your graveyard would be too full, and you'd pick other stuff at random. What's changed now is that you have a lot more control over your graveyard because a lot more things are banishing cards from your hand. So through intelligent blocking and management that way, you can actually control what's in your graveyard a lot more, which means the potential for looping something like one of these utility cards becomes a lot more viable. I think that's quite interesting. The other thing, of course, to consider is that all these cards banishing from hand for 0 or for 1 are actually really good for saving Levia from killing herself, right? Because, okay, you do need a 3-card hand to play them, but you will guarantee what card you're banishing, and that can sort of save you from Blood Debt, which is really good. And if one of them is in Arsenal before you play it, then obviously you only need a 2-card hand, things start to get a lot sweeter. Or, at a pinch, something like Shade and Scream will buff your weapon, and you know, you just need a 2-card hand and you can buff your weapon and swing in with +5 from something like a Shade and Scream. So there's a lot more options there to save yourself from dying from Blood Debt, which was the other issue with Levia, including Hellhammer, which will attack and banish itself for 2, and then will, of course, turn off Levia, which is actually just to save you. And then, of course, you have the late game savior, which is, of course, Levia Redeemed and Levia Consumed. The Redeemed side, obviously, just turns off all of your Blood Debt. If you've got 13 or more cards with Blood Debt in your banished zone, then you can turn off your Blood Debt and go down to 8 health. And the other side says if you were about to go to 13 life because of Blood Debt, you can basically, instead of taking Blood Debt, you banish top cards of your deck face down. Now, personally, I feel like, but you can also play cards from your banished zone. That's kind of important. So there's 2 ways to take this deck and this strategy. You're either looking for this, you're either looking for safety from Blood Debt once you've got 13 or more cards there. So you're getting down to 8 life. Maybe you go down to like 5 life, then you gain 3 life. And then your late game is playing without Blood Debt, but still playing powerful turns, still playing stuff back from the banished zone where you can, but also just hitting people with cards you have available and not worrying about dying from your own abilities. The alternative is you build to 13, you build as much Blood Debt as possible so you don't kill yourself with Shade and Death Hydra. And then when you get low and you start taking more damage, over 13 damage, you're going to switch to Levia Consumed, and then suddenly every time you have 2 cards left in your hand that are blues, which they will be because you'll have banished a lot of reds already, you're going to be coming in with a 13 power attack, which when your opponent doesn't have any armor left because it's late game, is going to be quite impactful, even if it doesn't have an on-hit. And that's kind of really the aim of the game, I think, with this deck. And this is obviously first draft, bit of toolbox in there. May not need any of these, may not need life gain, may not need Ghostly Visit, whatever. They're just in there as ideas to consider. But generally what's going to happen is you're going to play a Dread Screamer, you're going to try and follow up with a Graveling Growl, or a Shade and Swing, or you're going to try and sort of line things together. You're going to try and sort of line it so that, when you banish, you play Ram Raider, you banish a Slithering Shadowpede, and then you hit them for 12. Maybe there's a Shadow Puppetry on something else instead. All those kind of things. And then maybe if you're running low on those kind of things, you play something like Shade and Scream. banish a card, play Deep-Rooted Evil. You know, there's lots of different ways around these things now, which I think is a lot more interesting. So I'm kind of excited for Levia. She's a lot more linear than the other two heroes, I think, but I think she has a lot of depth that people are going to explore. And then I said I'd talk about Bolton because I don't have a deck prepared for him yet just because of the timings. I will say I don't know how Bolton's going to go. There are a lot more cards here that reward charging, specifically charging yellow. And we do have these bannerets, but I really don't know how much I trust yellow charging. I mean, it's just... Charging is just so inefficient because you have to have that 3-card hand. You have to have the card you're pitching to pay for the attack. You have to have the charge card. Now, I know there's a lot of 0-cost cards here, so maybe you can get away with the 2-cost hand. But the fact is that playing a 0 for 3 out of 2 cards isn't very good compared to the amount of damage other heroes can put forward. So it's not really answering the problem of how do I win the game. It still seems to me like Lumina is going to be the way he wins because it's the only way really to massively pay off with your charge cards. Though there are things like Lumina Lance now and Celestial Cataclysm. So maybe if he can charge a bit more consistently with these 0-cost charge attacks, then, you know, he's going to get better off in that way. You know, he's going to be able to do things that aren't just Lumina Ascension. But I will say that to me, it still looks quite clunky. So I'm really keen for people to get into the weeds on that. Kind of let me know what they think. I don't have as deep a take. I have played the other 3 heroes, including Levia, to a certain extent. So I have a bit more of a strong take on their flaws and their weaknesses. I haven't really played Bolton in super amounts of detail. They are quite interesting. I did say that what Bolton needed was a way to get rewarded for charging, and it seems to have developed that a bit. So it will be interesting to see what he can do and what happens with those new cards. With that, that is a overview of the classes and how I think they're going to be built from Dusk to Dawn. I hope you found that interesting. If you have any questions, please do put comments in the video. The next video I will be putting up is going to just be a card-by-card review of Dusk to Dawn. I'm just waiting for the last few Dusk to Dawn cards to be spoiled. I have seen most of them, but I think there are 2 or 3 generics that I haven't seen yet, and I'd like to get those in front of me before I sit down and review the whole set, rather than trying to come back and doing it later. As a reminder, if you have liked this video, please do like and subscribe. There are also ways to get in touch if you have questions or feedback. You can kind of see links to that at the bottom of the video. The only other thing to note is I am still doing my writing project. I am working on chapter 6. Just slow going. It's a big chapter. It's sort of, you know, I'm aiming for about 20,000 words. It's quite meaty, has a lot going on, so I'm taking my time with it. It's also this like really interesting big battle between Solana and the demons, so I don't really want to rush it. I'd rather take my time and make it more impactful. You can find that on wraithfables.com if that sounds interesting. Also on this channel you will find a playlist. I've started doing audio versions of the chapters for those who do not like to read but would prefer to listen, voiced by myself. Chapter 1 is up there right now, and chapter 2 will be coming out soon. So thanks everyone for listening. I've been Steelfur, this has been Steelfur Speaks, and I will talk to you all very soon.